Edit. The most dangerous mistakes are not the ones people make. They are the ones everyone agrees to ignore. The rain fell steadily against the tall windows of Sterling House, one of the most exclusive private dining clubs in downtown Manhattan. Inside, warm golden light reflected off crystal glasses and polished walnut walls. Conversations remained quiet, controlled, expensive. At a long table near the center of the room, a group of attorneys, executives, and investors sat around a contract worth nearly $300 million. Every page had been reviewed. Every clause had been discussed. Every signature line was ready. At the head of the table sat William Sterling. At 44, he was one of the most successful private equity investors in America. Business magazines called him brilliant. Financial reporters called him fearless. William preferred another word: efficient. He believed talented people revealed themselves quickly, and untalented people did too. Across the room, Emily Carter moved silently between tables carrying a silver tray. Her black apron was neatly pressed. Her blonde hair was tied back. Most guests barely noticed her. To them, she was simply part of the background. Another waitress. Another employee. Another person serving dinner while important people discussed important things. William noticed her only because she never seemed intimidated. Everyone else in the room reacted when he entered. Emily did not. She took orders, refilled coffee, cleared plates. Calm, professional, unimpressed. That confidence irritated him more than he cared to admit. The meeting had gone well. The attorneys had finalized the language. The investors were satisfied. The acquisition would likely close within days. One of the lawyers raised a glass. Congratulations, William. This may be the cleanest contract we have handled all year. Several people nodded. William smiled. That is what I pay you for. Laughter moved around the table. At that moment, Emily approached carrying fresh coffee. She quietly refilled several cups. William watched her for a moment. Then an idea entered his mind. Small, harmless, amusing. At least that was how it seemed. He reached for the contract. Nearly 100 pages bound inside a dark leather folder. Then he slid it across the table. The movement immediately caught everyone's attention. Emily paused. Sir. William leaned back in his chair. I have a question. The attorneys exchanged curious glances. Emily remained polite. For a moment, nobody answered. The question seemed strangely specific. The amusement that had filled the table seconds earlier faded into uncertainty. Several attorneys exchanged quick glances. One executive shifted in his chair. Even William Sterling's smile weakened slightly. Emily remained standing beside the table, her hand resting lightly on the closed folder. Calm, patient, waiting. Finally, one of the senior attorneys cleared his throat. I did. Emily nodded politely. Thank you. The attorney straightened his tie. Why do you ask? Emily looked at the contract, but still did not open it. Because indemnification clauses are usually where people become overconfident. The room grew quiet again. William folded his arms. You have not even read it yet. Emily looked at him. I know. Then how can you possibly have an opinion? A few smiles returned around the table. Emily surprised everyone by smiling as well. I do not have an opinion. She glanced toward the attorney. I have a question. The attorney leaned forward. Go ahead. Emily carefully opened the folder. Nearly 100 pages sat neatly organized before her. She slowly turned the first few pages. Not rushing. Not performing. Simply reading. The rain continued tapping softly against the windows while the restaurant carried on around them. Glasses clinked. Quiet conversations drifted through the room. Yet at William's table, every sound seemed distant. Everyone was watching her. Emily stopped on a page near the middle of the contract. Her eyes moved across several paragraphs. Then another page. Then another. The process took less than 2 minutes. William checked his watch. One investor shook his head, clearly amused. This is unbelievable, he whispered. She is actually reading it. Emily reached the section she wanted and paused. Her expression never changed. That bothered William more than he expected. Most people revealed excitement when they thought they had discovered something important. Emily revealed nothing. Interesting, she said softly. The attorney smiled. What is? Emily looked up. May I ask another question? Of course. Why does this clause define responsibility differently than the language used in Section 11? The attorney frowned immediately. William noticed the reaction. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. Emily turned the folder around, and pointed to a paragraph. Here. Several people leaned closer. The attorney adjusted his glasses and began reading. At first, nothing happened. Then his expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. The investor beside him stopped smiling. William leaned forward. What is it? The attorney continued reading silently. Emily remained quiet. Finally, the attorney looked up. That is not possible. Another lawyer reached for the document. Let me see. The second attorney reviewed the page. Then flipped back several sections. Then forward again. The confidence around the table began to disappear. William watched the exchange carefully. Someone explain what is happening. The second attorney looked up slowly. The terminology changes. Meaning? William asked. Meaning the obligation described here may not match the obligation defined earlier. Silence. The words hung over the table like a storm cloud. One investor laughed nervously. That sounds technical. The attorney did not laugh. It is technical. He looked back at Emily. But it is also important. William stared at the contract. Then at Emily. You found that in 2 minutes. Emily closed the folder gently. No, William frowned. No. I found it the moment I saw who wrote the clause. For the first time all evening, nobody had a clever response. Nobody laughed. Nobody smiled. Outside, rain continued sliding down the glass. Inside, the atmosphere had changed completely. What began as a joke no longer felt like one. And as William looked across the table at the waitress standing calmly before a room full of experts, an uncomfortable thought entered his mind. Maybe this conversation was not going where he expected it to go at all. The silence lingered longer than anyone expected. The attorneys continued reviewing the contract while the investors watched with growing unease. What had started as entertainment was becoming something else entirely. Emily Carter remained standing beside the table, her posture relaxed, her expression unchanged. She did not appear proud of herself. She did not appear nervous. If anything, she seemed mildly curious about what the attorneys would discover next. William Sterling noticed that detail immediately. Most people enjoyed being right. Emily seemed completely indifferent to it. One of the attorneys finally lowered the contract and looked directly at her. How did you know where to look? Emily glanced at the page. Patterns. The attorney frowned. That is not an answer. It is the only answer I have. A few people exchanged confused looks. William leaned forward. Explain. Emily hesitated for a moment. Not because she appeared uncomfortable, but because she seemed to be deciding how much to say. When people write contracts, they usually have habits. She looked toward the attorney who had drafted the clause. Word choices. Structural preferences. Certain phrases they repeat. The attorney nodded slowly. Emily continued. Most mistakes happen when those patterns suddenly change. William folded his hands. So you noticed the language shift? Yes. Without reading the entire agreement. Correct. Several investors looked genuinely stunned. One shook his head. That sounds impossible. Emily smiled slightly. Not impossible. Just easier when you pay attention. The attorney reopened the contract and reviewed the clause again. Then he turned several pages backward, then forward once more. The expression on his face grew increasingly serious. Another lawyer joined him. They began quietly discussing legal terminology. Neither appeared amused anymore. William watched carefully. He had spent years evaluating people in high-pressure situations. Confidence could be faked. Intelligence could be exaggerated. Expertise could be marketed. But genuine competence looked different. Genuine competence was calm, efficient, precise. Emily possessed all three. Across the room, the restaurant continued operating normally. Servers carried trays. Guests enjoyed expensive dinners. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers. Yet around William's table, the atmosphere had completely changed. Nobody was paying attention to the food anymore. The contract had become the center of everything. One investor finally laughed nervously. All right. She found one issue. Several people nodded. The comment seemed to restore a little confidence. Even experts miss things sometimes. William considered that possibility. Maybe the entire situation was being exaggerated. Maybe Emily had simply noticed a small inconsistency. An interesting coincidence. Nothing more. Then one of the attorneys spoke again. Actually, there may be a larger problem. Every head turned toward him. He adjusted his glasses and pointed toward another section of the agreement. If this language creates ambiguity here, it could affect the interpretation of multiple obligations throughout the contract. The room froze. William felt his stomach tighten slightly. How significant? The attorney looked uncomfortable. Potentially very significant. Another lawyer nodded in agreement. Much more significant than we initially thought. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Rain continued sliding down the windows. The city lights beyond the glass appeared blurred and distant. William looked at Emily. She had not reacted. Not even slightly. Did you know that? He asked. Emily looked down at the contract. Then back at him. I suspected it. The attorney stared at her. You suspected it? Emily nodded. That is why I asked who wrote the clause before I read it. The attorney slowly closed the folder. The sound echoed softly across the table. For the first time that evening, William realized something uncomfortable. The contract was no longer the mystery. Emily was. And as he watched the quiet waitress standing calmly before a room full of attorneys, investors, and executives, he found himself asking a question he had never expected to ask. Who exactly was she? Nobody returned to their dinner. The plates remained untouched beneath the warm restaurant. Lights while the contract sat at the center of the table like an unexpected guest. William Sterling looked around at the attorneys and investors who had seemed so confident less than an hour earlier. That confidence was fading. Slowly, quietly. One question from a waitress had accomplished what dozens of meetings had not. It had introduced doubt. Emily Carter noticed the silence and gently closed the folder. I should get back to work. One of the investors immediately spoke. Wait. Emily paused. Yes. He pointed toward the contract. There is something I do not understand. Emily waited patiently. You found a problem by noticing a change in language patterns. Yes. But why would anyone make that mistake? Several people nodded. It was a reasonable question. Emily glanced at the attorney who had drafted the section. Her expression remained respectful. Most mistakes are not caused by carelessness. The attorney looked surprised. They are not. Emily shook her head. Most mistakes happen because people become familiar with their own thinking. William listened carefully. Meaning? Emily folded her hands lightly in front of her. When someone works on a document for weeks, they stop reading what is on the page. She looked at the contract. They start reading what they expect to see. The words landed harder than anyone expected. One attorney slowly nodded. Another looked down at the folder. Nobody argued. Deep down, every professional at the table recognized the truth. Emily continued. That is why fresh eyes matter. William found himself studying her again. There was no arrogance in her voice. No desire to embarrass anyone. She spoke with the calm certainty of someone describing something obvious. Across the room, a server passed carrying a tray of desserts. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers. Rain continued tapping against the windows. Yet William barely noticed any of it. His attention remained fixed on Emily. How often do you do this? He asked. Emily blinked. Do what? Analyze contracts. A faint smile appeared on her face. Not often. One investor laughed. That answer cannot possibly be true. Emily shrugged gently. It is true. William leaned back in his chair. Then what exactly were you looking for when you opened the folder? Emily thought for a moment. Risk. The answer surprised everyone. Risk? William repeated. Emily nodded. Every agreement tells a story. Nobody spoke. Some stories are clear. Others hide important details in small places. She glanced toward the contract. I was trying to understand where the risk was hiding. The table fell quiet again. One of the attorneys reopened the folder and reviewed several pages. Then several more. His expression tightened. There may be another issue. Every head turned immediately. William sat forward. What kind of issue? The attorney pointed to a section near the end of the agreement. A cross-reference error. Another lawyer leaned closer. Let me see. They began quietly reviewing the language. Minutes passed. The investors watched nervously. Emily remained standing beside the table, calm as ever. Finally, the second attorney looked up. His face had lost all traces of confidence. She is right. William frowned. About what? The attorney swallowed. If this reference is interpreted incorrectly, certain protections may not apply the way we intended. Silence swept across the table. The first problem had been concerning. This one felt worse. Much worse. William slowly turned toward Emily. Did you notice that too? Emily hesitated. For the first time all evening, she seemed slightly uncomfortable. I noticed something unusual, and you did not mention it. She looked at the contract, then back at him. You only asked me to find one mistake. No one laughed. No one even smiled. because suddenly everyone understood the same thing. The waitress had not found one problem. She had found two. And the night was no longer about a contract. It was about discovering how the least expected person in the room had become the most difficult one to ignore. The atmosphere around the table had changed completely. Earlier in the evening, people had been smiling. Now they were reading. Every attorney had a copy of the contract open. Every investor was paying attention. Even the waitstaff moving through the restaurant seemed less noticeable than the stack of papers sitting beneath the chandelier light. William Sterling stared at Emily Carter for several seconds. The second mistake bothered him more than the first. Not because it was larger, because she had seen it and chosen not to mention it. You only asked me to find one mistake. Her words continued echoing in his mind. There was something unsettling about that answer. It was not clever. It was not sarcastic. It was simply true. Emily glanced toward the dining room. Several tables needed service. A manager was speaking with guests near the entrance. The restaurant was still operating normally despite the storm of uncertainty gathering around William's table. I really should get back to work, she said quietly. One of the investors immediately shook his head. Not yet. Emily looked at him politely. Sir, I want to know something. He pointed toward the contract. How many other issues did you notice? The question landed heavily. Several attorneys looked up. William watched her carefully. Emily thought for a moment. I do not know. One lawyer frowned. You do not know? No. She looked at the folder. I stopped looking after I found enough reasons to be concerned. The room became silent again. William almost laughed at the simplicity of the answer. Most consultants he hired produced lengthy presentations, endless charts, complicated explanations. Emily had reached the same conclusion with a handful of observations. One attorney slowly removed his glasses. That might be the most honest answer anyone has given tonight. Emily smiled slightly. Honesty is usually cheaper than litigation. For the first time in several minutes, a few people laughed. The tension eased slightly. Yet William noticed something important. The laughter was different now. Nobody was laughing at Emily anymore. They were listening to her. The distinction mattered. One of the younger attorneys reopened the contract and began flipping through pages. Then he suddenly stopped. Hold on. Several people looked toward him. He pointed to a section near the back of the agreement. There is another inconsistency here. A second attorney leaned over. Where? This definition references an outdated version of the schedule. The attorney's face tightened. That should not be there. William felt a strange sensation. Not frustration. Not anger. Respect. The deeper they looked, the more questions appeared. And every question seemed to validate Emily's instincts. She had not identified specific errors because she possessed magical insight. She had identified risk because she knew where risk liked to hide. There was a difference. A very important difference. William looked at her. You expected this, did you not? Emily hesitated. Expected what? That they would find more problems. She considered the question carefully. I expected that if one section had not been reviewed properly, other sections might deserve another look. One attorney nodded slowly. That is exactly what we are discovering. Rain continued sliding down the tall windows. Beyond the glass, Manhattan shimmered beneath thousands of lights. Inside, coffee had grown cold. Dinner had been forgotten. The contract now looked very different from the flawless agreement everyone had celebrated earlier. William leaned back in his chair and studied Emily once more. She was still wearing the same black apron, still carrying the same order pad, still standing in the same restaurant. Yet somehow she no longer seemed like part of the background. She felt like the only person in the room who had seen the entire situation clearly from the beginning. And for the first time all evening, William found himself less interested in the contract than in the woman who had quietly exposed its weaknesses without ever trying to prove she was smarter than anyone else. Emily finally returned to her work, but the conversation did not end when she walked away. In many ways, it was only beginning. William Sterling remained seated long after the others expected the evening to conclude. Around him, attorneys continued marking pages. Investors exchanged increasingly concerned looks. The contract that had once inspired confidence now inspired caution. Every new review seemed to uncover another question. Every question led to another layer of uncertainty. William watched the process unfold in silence. Across the dining room, Emily moved from table to table carrying coffee, delivering meals, and speaking with guests. Nothing about her behavior suggested she had just altered the course of a major business transaction. That calmness stayed with him. Most people wanted recognition. Emily appeared completely uninterested in it. Nearly 30 minutes later, one of the senior attorneys approached William with a stack of notes. His expression said enough before he spoke. "We need a full review." William looked up. "That's serious?" The attorney nodded. "Much more serious than I thought an hour ago." He placed the papers on the table. "There are now 4 sections that deserve additional examination." William stared at the notes. 4 sections. The number felt impossible. Not because contracts contain mistakes. Every contract contained mistakes. What troubled him was that an entire team of specialists had overlooked them, while a waitress had sensed the problem almost immediately. "What changed?" William asked quietly. The attorney hesitated. "Perspective." William frowned. "Explain." The attorney glanced toward Emily across the room. "We reviewed the document to confirm it was correct." He tapped the papers. "She reviewed it to discover where it might fail." The answer lingered. William slowly leaned back in his chair. Different objectives. Different outcomes. The realization felt uncomfortably simple. At that moment, Emily approached carrying a fresh pot of coffee. "Would anyone like a refill?" Her voice sounded exactly the same as before. Professional. Warm. Ordinary. One investor laughed softly. "I think you have done enough for one evening." Emily smiled politely. "Coffee is still part of my job." Several people chuckled. The atmosphere had softened. The tension remained, but it had transformed into something closer to respect. William watched as she filled several cups. Then he asked the question that had been growing in his mind for the last hour. "Emily." She looked toward him. "Yes. Where did you learn to think like this?" The room immediately fell silent again. Everyone wanted the answer. Emily considered the question while placing the coffee pot on the table. "Life teaches people different things." William waited. "That is not really an answer." A faint smile crossed her face. "It is the only one I have." One attorney shook his head with amusement. "You keep doing that." "Doing what?" Emily asked. "Answering questions without fully answering them." Emily laughed quietly. It was the first time anyone had heard her laugh all evening. "Maybe." William noticed something unusual. For the first time, she seemed slightly guarded. Not defensive, just careful, as if there were parts of her story she preferred not to discuss. He respected that instinct. Yet his curiosity only grew stronger. The rain outside had begun to ease. The city lights beyond the windows appeared clearer now, reflecting across wet streets below. Inside Sterling House, the evening was drawing to a close. But as William looked at Emily Carter standing beneath the warm restaurant lights, he realized the contract was no longer the mystery that interested him most. The real mystery was how someone carrying an order pad and wearing an apron had quietly become the smartest voice in a room full of experts. And before the night ended, he intended to find out who she really was. The meeting finally ended close to midnight. One by one, the investors gathered their coats. Attorneys carried marked copies of the contract under their arms. Conversations that had begun with certainty now ended with caution. Outside, the rain had almost stopped. Thin streams of water still traced the windows, but the storm was fading. William Sterling remained seated long after everyone else had left. The contract lay closed before him, yet he was no longer thinking about the contract. He was thinking about Emily Carter. Across the dining room, staff members began preparing for closing. Chairs were adjusted. Tables were reset. Glassware disappeared into the kitchen. Emily moved through the room with the same quiet focus she had displayed all evening. No sign of pride. No sign of satisfaction. She worked as though nothing unusual had happened. William watched her for several moments before standing. He considered walking over and asking more questions. Instead, he chose patience. Some answers were easier to find when people were not expecting them. The next morning, sunlight filled the upper floors of Sterling Capital. The storm had passed completely. Manhattan sparkled beneath a bright blue sky. From his office overlooking the city, William reviewed reports from the previous night's legal review. The news was worse than anyone had expected, for problematic sections had already been confirmed. Additional concerns were still being evaluated. Millions of dollars in potential exposure had been avoided because the agreement had not been signed. The numbers mattered, yet they were not what held his attention. A different file sat open beside the contract review. A file containing information about Emily Carter. William rarely investigated people. Usually he could understand them within a few minutes. This time he knew he had failed. The preliminary report appeared ordinary at first. 29 years old. Resident of New York. Restaurant employment history. No scandals. No lawsuits. No remarkable public profile. William frowned. None of it explained what he had witnessed. He continued reading. Then he stopped. His eyes moved back to a single line. Academic records. He opened the attachment. Columbia Law School. Top-ranking performance. Multiple academic awards. National Contract Law Competition finalist. Published legal research. William sat perfectly still. He opened another document. Then another. Every file revealed the same pattern. Exceptional performance. Exceptional evaluations. Exceptional potential. Yet the timeline suddenly ended several years earlier. There was no record of graduation. No law firm employment. No explanation. Only silence. William leaned back slowly. The mystery had deepened, not disappeared. An hour later, an additional report arrived. This one contained the answer. He read it carefully. Then he read it again. Years earlier, Emily's father had suffered a severe health crisis. Medical bills accumulated rapidly. Her younger sister was still in school. Emily had withdrawn from her final year of legal studies and taken multiple jobs to support her family. What began as a temporary sacrifice became a permanent detour. Opportunities disappeared. Interviews were declined. Career plans were postponed indefinitely. While former classmates became attorneys, partners, and corporate advisors, Emily worked wherever steady income could be found. William stared at the skyline beyond his office window. Thousands of people moved through the streets below, each carrying a story nobody else could see. The realization settled heavily in his mind. Emily had never lacked talent. She had never failed. She had simply chosen responsibility over recognition. And somehow that made her achievements far more impressive than the titles hanging on the walls of many executives he knew. For the first time since their conversation began, William understood what he was really looking at. Not a waitress who happened to understand contracts. Not a hidden genius waiting to be discovered. But a woman who had quietly given up her own future so someone she loved could have theirs. The full legal review took another week. What began as a routine verification process quickly evolved into something far more serious. Every day brought new findings. Small inconsistencies became larger concerns. Clauses that initially appeared harmless revealed hidden liabilities. References pointed to outdated schedules. Definitions conflicted with one another. The deeper the legal team looked, the more questions emerged. William Sterling reviewed each report personally, not because he enjoyed legal details, because he could not stop thinking about how close he had come to signing the agreement. One Friday afternoon, the final assessment arrived. The conference room was unusually quiet as attorneys presented their conclusions. Several investors who had attended the original dinner meeting were present. So were senior members of Williams' executive team. The atmosphere felt completely different from the confidence that had filled Sterling House days earlier. A senior attorney placed a summary report on the table. Our recommendation is simple. William looked up. Walk away. No one argued. No one objected. The evidence was overwhelming. The acquisition target had disclosed information in ways that technically satisfied requirements while obscuring significant risks. The agreement itself contained enough weaknesses to create years of potential legal complications. Combined, the problems represented a level of exposure nobody was willing to accept. William stared at the report. Hundreds of millions of dollars had nearly moved forward based on assumptions everyone believed were safe. Everyone except Emily Carter. One investor slowly shook his head. If we had signed this 2 weeks ago, he never finished the sentence. He did not need to. Everyone in the room understood. The cost would have been enormous. Financially, legally, reputationally. William closed the report and looked out the conference room window. Manhattan stretched beneath a clear afternoon sky. People hurried along crowded sidewalks. Yellow taxis moved through intersections. Life continued as usual. Yet he could not stop replaying that evening in his mind. The silver tray, the black apron, the closed contract sliding across the table. The simple question that changed everything. Who wrote the indemnification clause? Such a small moment. Such an ordinary sentence. Yet it had exposed a flaw in the thinking of everyone present, including him. Later that evening, long after the meeting ended, William remained alone in his office. The city lights gradually replaced the daylight outside. His desk was covered with reports, summaries, and legal opinions. He looked at them for several minutes before setting them aside. The numbers no longer mattered. The lesson did. For years he had believed expertise was easy to recognize. Degrees, titles, offices, credentials. He had built an entire career evaluating people through visible indicators of success. Then a waitress had dismantled that assumption without ever trying to. Emily had not asked for attention. She had not demanded recognition. She had not attempted to impress anyone. She simply paid attention where others stopped looking. William found himself smiling slightly. The irony was impossible to ignore. The most valuable consultant he had encountered all year had been carrying coffee instead of a briefcase. The person who protected his company from a costly mistake was the same person he had expected to embarrass with a challenge. He stood and walked toward the window. Reflections of city lights shimmered across the glass. Somewhere out there, Emily was probably finishing another shift, serving tables, greeting customers, living exactly as she had before, completely unaware that an entire boardroom was discussing decisions shaped by her observations. William looked down at the contract one final time before placing it in a drawer. Then he made a decision of his own. The acquisition would be abandoned. The risk was too great. The evidence was too clear. But there was something else he intended to do. Something that had nothing to do with contracts or investments. Because after everything he had learned, one truth remained impossible to ignore. He had discovered the cost of signing the agreement. Now he wanted to understand the value of the person who had stopped him from doing it. 3 days later, William Sterling returned to Sterling House. The weather could not have been more different from the night they first met. The storm was gone. Sunlight reflected across the city. The restaurant glowed beneath warm evening light, elegant and calm. Guests filled the dining room. Glasses sparkled beneath chandeliers. Soft music drifted through the air. Everything looked ordinary. Yet for William, the place would never feel ordinary again. He entered without investors, attorneys, or executives. No contracts. No negotiations. No audience. Just a man carrying a lesson he could not forget. Emily Carter was arranging menus near the hostess station when she noticed him. For a brief moment, surprise crossed her face. Then her familiar calm returned. "Good evening," she said. "Welcome back." William smiled. "Thank you." Emily glanced around the restaurant. "Table for one." "Actually, I was hoping to speak with you." She studied him for a moment, then nodded toward a quiet table near the window. A few minutes later, they sat across from each other. The city lights outside were beginning to appear as daylight faded. Between them rested 2 cups of coffee. Neither spoke immediately. The silence felt comfortable. William realized that was another thing he respected about Emily. She never rushed to fill empty space. Finally, he reached into his jacket and placed a folder on the table. Emily looked at it, but did not touch it. "Another contract?" she asked. William laughed softly. "No good." The answer made him smile. "This one is much shorter." Emily waited. William took a breath. "The acquisition was canceled." She nodded once. "I thought it might be. You saved us from a very expensive mistake." Emily looked down at her coffee. "Your legal team did that." "No," William shook his head. "They corrected the mistake." He paused. "You found it." The words hung quietly between them. Emily did not appear uncomfortable. She simply accepted the truth without trying to enlarge it. "I'm glad it worked out." William studied her for a moment. Then he pushed the folder gently across the table. "There is an offer inside." Emily glanced at it. "A legal position? Research? Strategy? Risk analysis? Whatever title you want." She looked back at him. "You are serious." "Completely." Emily rested her hands around the coffee cup. Warm light reflected softly in the window beside her. "Why?" William smiled. "Because I spent years believing talent always introduced itself properly." He looked down briefly before continuing. "You taught me otherwise." Emily remained silent. William continued. "I investigated your background." A faint smile appeared. "I assumed you would." "I learned what happened." Emily's expression softened slightly. Not sadness. Acceptance. "Life happened." William nodded. "You gave up opportunities most people would never walk away from." Emily looked toward the window. "Family is not something you walk away from." The answer carried no regret. That was what surprised him most. William slowly pushed the folder closer. "You earned opportunities too." For several seconds, Emily said nothing. Then she opened the folder. She read quietly. No dramatic reaction. No visible excitement. Just careful consideration. Finally, she closed it. This is generous. It is deserved. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. A genuine smile. Warm. Grateful. I will think about it. William laughed softly. That sounds exactly like you. Outside, the city lights continued appearing one by one. Inside, the restaurant carried on around them. Ordinary conversations. Ordinary dinners. Ordinary people. Yet William knew he would remember this evening for the rest of his life. Not because of a contract. Not because of money. But because a waitress had reminded him of something success had almost made him forget. The smartest person in the room is not always the one holding the title. Sometimes it is the one quietly paying attention while everyone else assumes they already know the answer.